Posey and Jason Rinaldo from the libraries, and they're going to give us an overview of SciENcv, right, and ORCID support services. And after today's overview, I encourage you to kind of go back and use the information that we've been given here. But we are going to have our next Q&A, I believe, is November 12th. Somebody correct me if that's not right. And it's going to be about SciENcv and ORCID, and we're going to dive a little deeper. Feel free to ask questions today, but just know that our next Q&A, we are going to dive a little deeper into this subject. So please join me in welcoming Rachel and Jason.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel.
And I'm Jason.
Which you could probably have guessed. And we're just going to talk a little bit about some new requirements that are coming up to do with ORCID and with SciENcv, as well as ways the libraries can kind of help you navigate all of those. So just a quick sort of reason why we're here. For anybody who is subject to either looking to get funding from the NIH for research training, fellowship, research education, and career development awards. All of those people will be required to have an ORCID beginning in fiscal year 2020, so January of 2020. And then also starting in January of 2020, the NSF will be requiring everybody submitting either a grant application or anything that you'd have to submit a Biosketch for to use an approved format. And SciENcv is one of the tools that you can use to help you create your approved format for the NSF Biosketch. So this will be a system that you'll kind of be required to start using beginning in January of next year. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason so he can start telling you about ORCID.
Okay, so I want to give you a quick introduction to ORCID if you're not familiar with it already. But it's a digital number that puts the researcher in control, helps them connect researchers to their research output, enables researchers to carry their profile wherever they go. It's theirs. It's not tied to the institution. Allows others to access and share that body of work. It streamlines things like publication, submission, workflows. Often how it's presented is to eliminate name ambiguity. So if you're a John Smith, for instance, there are a lot of John Smiths. And so how do you tell that this piece of research came from which John Smith? You might have changed your name over the course of your life. And so then again, this is a way that this number can help tie your research from across your career together. And it works across different types of outputs, disciplines, and institutions. Here's what an ORCID ID looks like. This is the one for Carolyn Mattingly. Over 5 million researchers worldwide have an ORCID ID. It's a number that every researcher ought to have. And here's what an ORCID record profile looks like. Within that, there are, you can include publications like journal articles, books, book chapters, data sets, theses, dissertations, your peer review activity, affiliations like employment, education, qualifications, membership and service, distinctions and awards, and use of research resources. So it includes lots of information about a researcher. And just to give some sense of how widespread this is, there are 1.3 million of these records. There are 1.3 million records have works in them, and there are 35 million works represented in ORCID. Lots of funding is represented there as well, and that number is increasing. So, okay. Why ORCID? Why are your researchers going to care about ORCID? So I want to talk some about the use cases here. And one of the first questions that we often get from researchers is like, how's this differ from other researcher profile systems like Google Scholar? And the big difference, the big advantage of ORCID is in the reuse of the data. The idea is that you enter the data once and you're able to reuse it often, increasingly able to reuse it across publishing, funder, and employer workflows. Okay, so I'm going to tell a story about why researchers might care about ORCID for you. So how do researchers find each other? Well, one way is they go to the journal article page and they click on the corresponding author and they might email them, and then, oh, maybe the emails doesn't work anymore. So in this case, though, you click on the corresponding author's name, and what you see is, you see this ORCID ID here, which when you click on it, you can get more information about this person, including other names, other websites that are associated with them, other IDs, their employment history, works, and all. And so the idea is that by improving the discoverability of our researchers' work in this way, we also are increasing their impact. Their other work is more likely to get cited and read when it's easily discovered. So lots of journals are requiring ORCID, at least for corresponding authors. Here's just a few of them. And then one of the neat things that ORCID allows you to do in this publication workflow is that when you use your ORCID ID when you publish, the publisher pushes that citation to your associated ORCID record. And then there's a service, Crossref, that creates the DOI. And then Crossref pushes that citation to your ORCID record automatically. The idea is that researchers don't have to be entering this data themselves. Use it when they publish, and it gets entered in the system automatically, and then is available for reuse. So here's what the result looks like. This auto update came in via Crossref. The researcher didn't have to do anything other than use it when they published. Okay, so now I'm going to say a little bit about how ORCID relates to funding.
And back to me again. So ORCID also comes in really handy when you're applying for funding, particularly from the NIH or the NSF. Like we mentioned at the very beginning, so when ORCID is required for research training, fellowship, research education, and career development awards. It also comes in handy, again, if you're having to create a biosketch, you're having to go through SciENcv. ORCID actually interacts with that system or interfaces with that system. So all this work you're going to do to pull all of your publications into ORCID, which I think Jason's going to talk about more later, you can use all of that information to then pull information into your or your researcher's biosketch, so you don't have to type things 3, 4, 5, 6, 20,000 times. So what is SciENcv exactly? So it's a system, it's created and managed by the NIH. So the libraries have nothing to do with creating or managing it. We can't really troubleshoot issues that are going on in it, but we can help walk you through how it works. It stands for the Science Experts Network Curriculum Vitae. It is capitalized bizarrely for reasons that are unknown to everybody. But you can use it to create and maintain your biosketch for either an NIH or an NSF grant application or an annual report. So it pulls information from other systems. So it pulls from ORCID. It also pulls from things like if you've got a MyNCBI account already with my bibliography, if you've got an ERA Commons account. So it allows you to sort of quickly create a biosketch, and then when you create a new biosketch, you've already got that information filled in from the first one, so you can build upon them, as opposed to having to reinvent the wheel every single time you have to make one. All right, so to access SciENcv, you can go through the NCBI's website, or if you just Google SciENcv and actually spell it SciENcv, or SciENcv, you can also get to it that way. There's a bunch of different ways to log in. So you can create a native NCBI account, or if you already have one, you can log in that way. You can log in using your institutional Gmail. So there's an option if you just hit Google or Gmail. You can use your Unity ID and password to log in, so that's one less password to remember. If you've got an ERA Commons account or an NSF Fastlane account, you can log in that way. You can also log in with your ORCID. So if you're going to go ahead, or if your researcher is going to go ahead and create an ORCID account, they don't want to create another account, they can sign in using their ORCID. So for most users, you'll get a little box at the bottom of your MyNCBI page with a SciENcv information. These can move around. If you've ever had an NCBI account before, you might have to go searching for it, but usually it's at the bottom right. And these are just a few screenshots to help you when, if you want a visual reference. So you've got your button that says click here to start on the SciENcv page. The default for some reason is an ERA Commons login, but if you click that little see more third-party options, you see the Google. That's where you can sign in with your Unity ID and password. And finally, you'll see that little box that says click here to create a new CV. Some information you'll need to get into SciENcv. So if you already have an NCBI account, you can link all these other accounts to it. So that might be an ORCID account, it might be your ERA Commons, NSF Fastlane. So at some point, you'll just need the login information for every account you want to mix together. Once all these accounts are linked, though, you can pull all this information in here, so you only have to type it in one place. As a delegate, which might be the case for a lot of the people in this room, any MyNCBI account holder can add delegates, and a delegate, they can view, edit, and create profiles in the original account holder's SciENcv. They can also edit the account holder's MyBibliography. So those are both two different ways where you can pull publications into a Biosketch. So a delegate can pretty much manage this whole thing. Delegate access, it does have to come from the researcher. So you'll get an email that says that you've been invited to be a delegate on somebody else's account. You'll just have to click the link, confirm your connection, and then at the bottom of your SciENcv page, you'll see a little thing that says SciENcv accounts delegated to you. So I think this is a colleague of mine. So you can see at the very bottom, I am one of her, she can access mine. She's a delegate for me. So, so you can be a delegate for any number of people, and you can manage this information for them, so they don't have to, again, do all this pulling together themselves. There's a few things I just wanted to point out about the NSF Biosketch. The format has changed since January of last year. So if you're using an older template, it's not going to match what the NSF is currently looking for, which is part of why they're trying to get everybody to use SciENcv, just because then you know that your format is up to date. It is exactly what the NSF is looking for. And so you're not risking getting a grant application thrown out because it's not matching the format. And there's a few different sections. So professional preparation, appointments, products, and synergistic activities are all that's on there now. There used to be another section on there, which I can't recall what it is offhand, but that section is now missing, which is why, again, you do kind of want to make sure you're using SciENcv. Just a quick screenshot so we can see what it looks like. When you're in SciENcv, you'll have all of these different sections. You've got places where you can click and fill everything out. When you go to create a new Biosketch, that's that screenshot on everybody's left. So you'll just want to give it a name. You'll pick your format, so that can be either NIH or NSF. You can choose a data source, so you can start a blank document, but if you've already linked your account to your ORCID profile, you can pull information from your ORCID profile. Or if you've already made a Biosketch, you can pull information from an existing Biosketch. And then you can turn sharing on when you're done so anybody can see it. So how does ORCID work with SciENcv? ORCID will allow you to pull citations into the Biosketch for the product section or the personal statement and contribution section if you're doing an NIH Biosketch. ORCID really makes it a lot easier to pull in citations for non-traditional publications, so if you've got white papers, government docs, anything like that. It also makes it easier to pull in journal articles that aren't in PubMed. So PubMed makes it really easy to pull in things that are already in PubMed because PubMed, MyNCBI, SciENcv, they're all kind of running from the same platform. But if you're pulling anything that's not in PubMed, it's sometimes easier to go through ORCID. It'll give you access to all of the journals that are out there instead of just the PubMed journals. You can also use ORCID to pull in information from their ORCID profile, so things about education, appointments, anything like that. However, you do want to take a look, check all information that's coming from an external source, whether that be ORCID, whether that be ERA Commons. There can be some formatting issues, so I think when I created a Biosketch, it missed out the institutions, or not the cities of the institutions where I had been. So you do just want to check and make sure that all that information is correct if you're pulling it in from an external source. And finally, this is just about all I've got to say about SciENcv, but I did want to point out we've got some help options. So the library has a guide with step-by-step instructions on how you set all this up, how you work as a delegate, and that's that first link there. If you need to troubleshoot your account, so if accounts aren't linking up correctly, if they're not pulling in information the way you're expecting to, the quickest way to get help is to go through the NCBI help desk. You can either click that link or email them. If you're still kind of uncertain and having problems, you can submit a research consultation request, and someone from the libraries can work with you. We do ask that you try these other options first, just because there's very few of us, and there's a lot of you. So if you're all having problems at the same time, we won't be able to get to them. And then there's some other, there's tutorials and there's other videos if you have additional questions or you'd like to kind of see the process. And I think it's back over to Jason now.
So I'm going to introduce you to some of our services around ORCID, and it starts in an application that we've developed called the Citation Index, which is just a collection of citations that works by NC State affiliated people. This is the thing that we've been doing for over 12 years, which is to harvest citations to NC State affiliated people. And what we're doing now is we're allowing folks to connect their ORCID ID with their Unity ID. In order to encourage adoption of ORCID and make it easier for, to help folks to manage their ORCID records. So when they come to the citation index and click on Get Started, they go through this workflow. If they don't already have an ORCID ID, they can create one as part of it. And then they authorize the libraries to have some rights on their ORCID record to help them maintain it. And so a couple of things that we can do once researchers make this connection is, for works we know about already, and we know about a lot, we can push those to ORCID on behalf of the researcher in order to help their ORCID records get started. We would hate for them to have an ORCID ID because they're required to, and then a reviewer come and see a completely empty ORCID record. The citation index application can then also discover new works via ORCID, which then can be used in other systems. And this gets into some of the local auto update feature that's available. Once they've made this connection between their ORCID ID and their Unity ID, whenever their ORCID record is updated, and that can be automatically when they use it when they publish, the library's citation index profile page gets auto-updated with citations from ORCID, and then local systems can get updated as well. So here's just one example from engineering, from electrical and computer engineering. You go to one of their directory pages, and you scroll down the page. This list of publications is sourced from a library's API that feeds into that page. You click down a little bit further to view all publications, and you see a profile that looks like this, where you see their ORCID ID as well as the biography that's being pulled from ORCID. Scroll down further, and you can see a number of their works there as well that we were able to discover through various sources, in this case, from their ORCID record. And this is all structured data, so we can make it available in different citation formats. We have a DOI in this case, so we can find public access, open access copies, so that someone can get more immediate access to the work. And then this is an example of once we know about citations that weren't in someone's ORCID record, we can push those to ORCID for them, and so we can have a source of NC State University libraries in their ORCID record there. So we're an institutional member of ORCID, and that allows us that ability to write to ORCID, to be able to push data to ORCID. And this is a collaboration between the Office of Research and Innovation and the libraries went in on this membership. Okay, so I mentioned before the problem of researchers being required to have an ORCID ID, but then not having anything in their ORCID record. So we've got a solution for that. The libraries can help to bootstrap those ORCID records through what we're calling our CV service. We want to deal with that backlog of citation data that hasn't been entered into ORCID. And so we can jumpstart ORCID records by adding citations with DOIs to ORCID for folks. Really, for a researcher, it just takes 5 minutes of their time. They register their ORCID ID with the libraries and the citation index, and then they send us their CV or whatever other list of citations that they have. and we take it from there and we get things added both locally and to ORCID. We want to save the time of the researcher, amplify their research impact. Okay, so researcher comes and they're like, I need an ORCID and I have to create a Biosketch. So this is one kind of workflow that they could go through to help make this easier. First, they can sign up for ORCID and link it with their Unity ID. They can do that just by going to ci.lib.nccu.edu and clicking on Get Started. They can use our CV service to flesh out their ORCID record. Then they can go to SciENcv and use their ORCID record. They can link their ORCID with their MyNCBI account, create a new static Biosketch, use ORCID to pull in those publications, affiliations into SciENcv, and then export a beautiful Biosketch as a PDF to submit for proposal. And then they can keep their ORCID record up to date so that when they have the next one, they can also pull in any of the fresh data. Okay, hopefully that pulls it together a little bit. And this is the big message for you all.
So we did just want to point out, winter is coming. All these deadlines are January of 2020. Nobody wants to discover on December 21st, 22nd that all of these things are not working. So just remember to help your researchers test, make sure that SciENcv, ORCID, Biosketch, all those connections are up and running and pulling in correct information before the winter break, because nobody wants to come back and do this right before a grant application is due. Nobody wants to discover that things are not working when you really need them to be working. I think that's just about all we have for you. We wanted to point out again some of the help available to you for SciENcv, as well as for ORCID and the citation index. We have a page on the library's website about the citation index, and there's also an email that you can send to Jason's group, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
All right, and I think that's about all we have. We've got, yeah.
So we do have questions.
We have some time for questions, yes.
When you create the CV, does it have a date and time stamp somewhere so you know this is the most recent one when you're looking at, oh, did they capture all these other publications that just happened in the last month? And can you determine if it's in there?
So do you mean in the Biosketch or in ORCID? In the Biosketch, yeah. So when you create your Biosketch, you'll have a big list with a date next to when it was created for every single one. Yes.
So you said create a static Biosketch. Is there a permanent Biosketch that people can look at on SciENcv, or do you have to actually create one and submit it with a proposal?
So you have to create one and submit it with a proposal. You can make it public if you want people to be able to look at it, but it will not self-update. So as you publish, new publications won't be pulled in. That's a good question. So all of this, any particular part? So you can talk about the ORCID stuff.
Yeah, so how they're learning about the new requirements for the Biosketch format that's coming up this year for NSF, I don't know. How they're finding out about our services around ORCID, generally we're being invited to department meetings to present their version of this about ORCID, as well as spend some time in that meeting to get folks actually signed up and taking advantage of our service. But the bigger message, I don't know that I answered your question.
Yeah. So, yeah, for the Biosketch.
Does anyone else have an answer for how researchers are finding out about these new requirements? Looks like someone over here might have an answer or question. I'm sorry.
Our Associate Dean for Research has sent this out and will continue sending this out in her weekly digest to faculty and to department heads. And we've also encouraged our faculty every moment we can to try to do this early, because we've had some issues with people linking their ORCID with their SciENcv, and So we don't want to run into that problem in January when a deadline's due. So we're disseminating that as much as we can.
Yeah. Thank you. So hopefully they'll be hearing it from a few different places, but if they haven't heard from it from anybody else by the time they get to you, we'd love it if they could hear from you too.
Hi,
Whether or not they listen. Oh, sorry.
What's the timeline for the CV service?
So right now, what we can commit to is it's about, if you have a need for something more urgent, you need to let us know. But once we get a CV, it's about 20 days that we have in order to get. And what we try to do is we preference their most recent citations because of some of the ways in which it's being used for current awareness and on directory pages. But if we need to go back further, again, that's another thing. You can let us know and we can do that work in those cases. We want to be able to, we're just now introducing this to folks like you, so trying to figure out like how we can modify the service to meet your needs as well. That sort of like, is that the workflow? I think we need to figure out what sort of workflows we can have to, from the previous presentation, how the libraries can collaborate with you to be able to help solve some of these issues.
Any other questions?
Have you or any of your, have you been presented with the need for an ORCID ID? Show of hands. So, okay, a couple people are seeing this requirement already. Increasingly, I think it's going to be a requirement. So we'd like to help get you all ready. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.